Hey, everybody. I hope everybody is doing well. I hope everybody is healthy and not going too crazy staying home, but I also hope you're staying home. So stay home. And let's learn a little bit about the mid 1800 reforms. So we had been talking a little bit about the Underground Railroad. We talked about Harriet Tubman and her role there. We discussed how some of the trails went up north, and you had to reach at least, you can see the Ohio River. This is sort of the marker to let slaves know that they've reached free land. However, many of them continue on towards Canada. And there are actually even routes that went into Mexico because, ironically enough, even Mexico had freed their slaves at the time. So you either went towards Mexico or towards Canada. But of course, many of them stayed up north, just like we had talked about with some of those abolitionists we discussed the other day in class. We did talk a little bit in fifth period about sort of the Underground Railroad itself, how it had a lot of symbolism and secrecy to it, mostly because they didn't want the slave owners to understand what was going on. So they had a lot of codes talking a little bit about who was going to be helping them, where to go. We had a question in class about how some students were wondering how did they even know where to go, which was a great question. And sometimes they used songs they would sing on the farms. This is an example of one about following the drinking gourd. We said how the drinking gourd is the symbol for the Big Dipper, so the constellation in the sky. The Big Dipper happens to have the North Star in it. So just keep following that. And we talked about how they said the riverbank will make a mighty good road. So these are the slaves are singing this on the fields, on the plantations, knowing that there are slaves that are trying to escape. And it just gave them the way to go and continuing on. I talked about how Pegfoot, left foot, Pegfoot, traveling on, Pegfoot referred to a former war veteran who lost his leg in war and actually had a peg foot, but was helping to carry slaves out of slave territory and into the north. And so, anyway, I just thought that was really fascinating to share with you about that. Now, unfortunately, there was some resistance to abolition, right? So I think I had mentioned in class, not every northern state even was on board with abolition. Some of them didn't like the idea of abolition. They thought it was going to cause problems. It would shake too much up of our economy. So they passed in Congress something known as the gag rule, which basically said that nobody was allowed to talk about abolition in Congress. So it stopped any anti slavery petitions from being read or acted upon in the House. And in order to pass a law, right, this is where, in order to pass a law, right, you have to have it in the same form in both houses. So for the House to say that nothing can be discussed about it, it's really quite shocking. You see in this picture, this is John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives. Remember, we said he was president at the time, or after he was president, he became a member of the House of Representatives, and he was obviously against things like gag rules. But in the end, right, this is just something that people were not willing or able or just wanting to talk about in Congress. And it's unfortunate because it wasn't only that they didn't agree with abolition, but they were stopping it from moving forward at all. Another movement from the mid 1800 reforms is something known as transcendentalism. So, transcendentalism is more of a movement that we saw in literature and art. Transcendentalism, to transcend, means to rise above. So we're hoping to accomplish in transcendentalism being above all the mass chaos that's happening in the United States with the abolition and popular sovereignty and all this craziness. So the hope is to have you as a person to transcend the limits of your intellect, the emotions, your soul, to create an original relationship with the universe. That sounds so hippy dippy, if you will. But this is what they were hoping to do. Remember, we're still in this era of romanticism. trying to get away from the factory life and industry. So we want to have some sort of connection with nature and the rest of the world that doesn't include using a machine and working in a factory. So transcendentalism is just that, right? We're seeing this movement towards having sort of a relationship with nature, with the universe, being one with each other, right? And transcendentalism is going to be, again, a reaction against the Industrial Revolution, much like Romanticism. And many authors of the time came from the North, and you may have heard of them before. Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose books include Nature, Self-Reliance, and the American Scholar, along with Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden and Resistance to Civil Disobedience. Oh, I'm going back there, sorry. And in these two cases with Emerson and Thoreau, much of their writing is about focusing on nature and how we as a person can change because of nature. You see right there, Emerson has a book called Nature. Henry David Thoreau with Walden basically went and left his life, lived on Walden Pond for a year, lived off the fat of the land, built his own shelter, right? And he concentrated on this pond and finding out more about the pond and about nature and how he just became a different person. Again, we see self-reliance, resistance to civil disobedience, right? So we are being good Americans, but we're relying on ourselves. That's really what transcendentalism was hoping to be. Now, some of the things that transcendentalists wanted, and all of these sound really great, right? I want to give freedom to the slave, well being to the poor and the miserable, learning to the ignorant, health to the sick, peace and justice to society, right? So, as a transcendentalist, we want to make everything the best that it can be. And so being egalitarian, or maybe giving freedom to slaves, helping others in need, and at the same time, by doing that, you're making yourself a better person. And that's what a transcendentalist was hoping to accomplish. Some people did not like transcendentalism. An example would be Nathaniel Hawthorne. I asked a couple of you the other day if you had read The Scarlet Letter. And it's kind of an anti society type of story. And the Scarlet Letter just basically being like a commentary about how negative the world is, and we just have to accept it that way. So a transcendentalist has very lofty ideas, whereas somebody who's an anti-transcendentalist is somebody who says like it's impossible and you need to accept the world the way it is, right? So you have these differing viewpoints on being seen through literature and even in art, right? We saw some of the art in the Romantic era and listened to some of the music as well, right? So it's a lot of social commentaries. Some of the people within the United States felt as though they wanted to take it further than just the transcendentalist who has these dreams. They actually want to put these things into practice. So utopian communities started popping out all over the place. A utopian community, and you might know this, you probably have read in English class about utopian or dystopian societies, so on and so forth. So in America, we started having these communes that kind of popped out. Again, it's a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, and you'll notice the majority of these utopian communities are where? They're in the North, right? So you see them all over popping out in the North. And again, like I said, it's a reaction to this Industrial Revolution. We don't want to live this way anymore. So you have different religious groups, Shakers and Mormons, and then you have utopian communities like Furerites, Owenites, and Oneida. These are almost like, I don't know if you remember in World Slave learning about Robert Owen and Charles Fourier. These guys were the creators of socialism. And dun dun dun, I know everybody freaks out with socialism. But so it's the concept of we're working together, we're providing for society, whoever might need it, right? And then again, we have religious societies as well popping out. And again, it's just a reaction to what's happening. We talked the other day about Mennonites. Mennonites were a utopian community that could be found in Pennsylvania, and everybody's working together and equal in society, and that's just the goal in that particular case. So again, yep, here we go. We've got our Mennonites. They're dedicated to the perfection of society. Everybody's equal. So men, women, children, freed slaves, right? Everybody's on the same page, which is unheard of at the time period in America, especially for women and, of course, for freed slaves. Now, Shakers were a really interesting group of people. So, Shakers were a religious society that, again, like I said, it was a utopian community. It was based on equality. And they have an actual legacy, but we're going to talk about why they died out. So, Shakers were a religious group who would get together and they would dance. And when they would dance, it looked like they were shaking, which is kind of like where they got this idea of being called a shaker. Ironically enough, Shakers did not believe in reproduction. They thought that they needed to spread the word of God and they would add their numbers that way. They died out. I think you could figure out why, but they do have a legacy. Shakers believed in a very simple life, living a simple life. So there's an architecture style, there's a design style called the Shaker style. Anything that is very minimalist is considered Shaker. So if you go into like a furniture store, go into a house that has very minimal things in it, that's considered like a Shaker style. There's also a song that was a Shaker hymn called Simple Gifts, right? So again, it's the same idea, same concept, simple gifts, right? 'Tis a gift to be simple, 'tis a gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be, right? So it's talking about living a very simple life, which makes sense because in the age of the Industrial Revolution, everything becomes complicated. It makes sense that Shakers would do that. I actually have 90s pop singer Jewel, who's going to sing a little bit of that song for you. And we'll take a wrong PowerPoint. Here we are. It's a gift to be free. It's a gift to come down where you ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, we'll be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning we come round right. All right, are we all sleeping now? That was beautiful, Jewel. Thanks so much. So anyway, you may have recognized that song, or at least the melody. I don't know. Anyway, the song just exemplifies everything that Shakers try to accomplish. Okay. We talked about Dorothea Dix a little bit in class. And what I love about Dorothea Dix is she was actually able to accomplish what she set out to do. So all of these reform movements, I don't know if you're noticing, sort of like, this is what we want, this is what we want, this is what we want. But they're not hugely successful. Dorothea Dix was actually successful, right? So she actually went around literally with a notebook and a pen, and she traveled from penitentiary to penitentiary and found out really disturbing things. This is specifically in Massachusetts that she saw, but she knows that it was throughout the nation, right? So first thing that she really struggled with was the fact that mentally ill were thrown in jail. You and I had a conversation with about that with Patrick Henry. Remember the whole thing with his wife, and she just felt like this is not a crime, and that needs to be fixed. She also found that there's zero medical care. She said the conditions were deplorable. in these penitentiaries, this is from her notebooks, people were locked in cages, closets, cellars, stalls, pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. She talked about how people slept in straw. In some of these cages, you couldn't sit down in or you couldn't lay down in, and you were in there all the time. She said if you broke your leg for whatever reason, you were stuck that way. Like she was shocked by how horrific these penitentiaries were. So she went to the legislation. She went to Massachusetts legislature, and she said that things need to change. And specifically, she said they need medicine, like they need medical aid. She also said that for those that were mentally ill, needed psychological help, and they shouldn't be in jail. Like, that's insane. So she said, we need to get, no pun intended, and we need to get the mentally ill out of the prisons and sent to what she called asylums. Now, you and I have some negative connotation to the word asylum. So we don't call them asylums, and asylums actually turned out to be not great either. However, at least at this point in time, they were able to pull those with mental conditions out of prisons and put them into a facility that actually had like beds and doctors, as opposed to what it was that they were experiencing. So go Dorothea. Oh, education reform. And I think it's amazing we're kind of like in our own little education reform right now. So Massachusetts, and you're noticing there's a lot with Massachusetts, right? Massachusetts is always the leader when it comes to many of the reform movements. They're very progressive. But when it comes to education, Massachusetts is the tops. Even today, Massachusetts always tops New Jersey for the best education in the United States. We're number 2. But Massachusetts was the first one to establish a tax support for local public schools. We never had public schools before. This is a new concept. And by 1860, every state offered free public education. So Horace Mann is actually the one who was the one that came up with this idea. He's considered the father of American education. So you can thank him for your public education. Thank you, Horace Mann. Children should be molded into a state of perfection, discourage corporal punishment, which is also good, and established a state teacher training program. So everything that we sort of see today within our education programs, he's the one who set the standard for it. So Horace Mann was hoping for, and he said everybody deserves a free education, no matter who you are. So he wanted to allow that for every person in America. We have this free enterprise system, right? Opportunity is everywhere, but if you don't have an education, the opportunity is limited. And that's something that Horace Mann wanted to fix. Amazingly enough, the first textbook was known as the McGuffey Eclectic Readers. And these were really cool. They had, you can see I have these little like vocabulary words here. There's the third eclectic reader, the second eclectic reader. But the difference is that they used religious parables to teach American values. So that's not something we're going to have today. Protestant ethic, talking about it. Typically, if we were in class, I would have you read a story from the McGuffey readers on the problems with being too rash is what it's called, and rash being like too quick to judge. And it talks about how a mom left a baby alone with a dog, and then a snake came in and the dog killed the snake, but the mom thought the dog killed the baby when she saw the dog with blood on his mouth. It was like, oh, it was like the craziest thing. But anyway, so this is not something that we typically see in our education system today. We try to avoid, of course, separation of church and state, but there's always that talk about like wellness today, right? Talking about how we have to take care of each other. So, although it's not quote unquote religious, there's still that idea of just being a good citizen. So that's nice. And lastly, this is the last one, I promise, is the temperance movement. So in 1826, the American Temperance Society was created by Francis Willard and the Beecher family. We're going to talk about one of the Beechers later, because there's this young lady called Harriet Beecher Stowe. of the Beecher family, who writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Very important later in the Civil War. Anyway, so what's the point of the temperance movement? Well, the point is to try and create a healthy lifestyle for men and boys specifically. Why? Because they're drinking too much alcohol. So what they preached was something that we would call like abstinence. So they're hoping that men and boys would abstain from drinking alcohol. Why is this happening? Well, unfortunately, especially because of the age of industry, the men who go off to work are frustrated, they're angry, they're unhappy, they're not making enough money. So after work, they typically stop at a pub and throw back a few. And then they come home and they take out their anger on their wives. So domestic violence had increased significantly because of the Industrial Revolution. And we talked about how that was sort of taboo to divorce your husband, even still with the Industrial Revolution. So this was the goal. The goal was to try and limit the alcohol consumption, mostly because they don't want, and this is like the saddest thing, the moms didn't want their sons to end up like their fathers, which is like great. It's just so sad. So they have this propaganda kind of posters. And you can see, like in the left side, the Temperance League, right? The woman is smashing through these barrels of rum and gin and whiskey. And then you also have the picture on the right, which is called like the effects of alcohol. So this guy is having these hallucinations, and there's fighting and terribleness and demon pig things and this demon pouring, and it's all coming from the alcohol, right? So obviously this is something that they're trying to do. Now, if we take a look at this chart, it's pretty impressive, right? So we don't really know the figures here, but by, let's figure this is like 1822, right? This is where it hits the highest. And I want you to notice it's 5 gallons of rum, whiskey, or gin or brandy. 5 gallons a year. Like that's a lot of alcohol. But notice, look how quickly it drops because of the temperance movement. I mean, that's a huge move. So successful, I would say. They didn't get rid of it altogether. Actually, Tennessee actually created a temperance law, and prohibition was a thing for like a year in Tennessee. And then they canceled that because they were losing a lot of money because Tennessee produces a lot of alcohol. And this is going to also sort of lead into women's rights, right? Because along with the temperance movement, that sort of pushes into women's rights. It was created by women. And women's rights were led the charge by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And the two of them focused a lot on being considered men's property. They said that's not something that needs to happen anymore. When we get married, that shouldn't be occurring, right? Talking about how they should have a say in government, that they should actually be in government, that they should be able to vote, like the whole deal. So they got together in 1848 at what's known as the Seneca Falls Convention. Can you guess where that is? Seneca? Seneca's New York. And they created what's known as the Declaration of Sentiments. So the Declaration of Sentiments is essentially the Declaration of Independence. So it starts off, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. But then it goes on to talk more about how women do not have to give up their money. They don't have to give up their property. They have the right to vote. They have the right to have a job and be educated. So all of those things were written in the Declaration of Sentiments. It also listed their grievances that they had with society and with men in general. And although none of that was ever really adopted until the 1900s, it still was the jumping off point for later in the year when we talk about people like Susan B. Anthony. So, of course, there was backlash to this, right? Not everybody agreed with women's rights, and there was propaganda on either side. And in this case, it's sort of, this was the title of this picture, right? If women had their own way, right? They'd be off gallivanting while the men were stuck at home washing and taking care of the children. So there was, again, with everything, there was the push forward for progress and then the pulling back to stop it from happening. So the resistance to it. And as time goes on, more of focus will be put on these changes because it was necessary. These things needed to change. And of course, you're working on your Frederick Douglass quarterly, your project, and obviously that's something that we're going to be working towards, is getting to emancipation, getting rid of slavery altogether. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed the podcast. We'll give you some more time to work on this tomorrow as well, and then please keep working on your project. If you have any questions, let me know, but have a great day.